power rarely rises without a shadow behind it. Bola Ahmed Tinubu stands as one of the most influential figures in Nigerian politics, a man celebrated for reshaping Lagos and building a network of power that stretched far beyond one state. Yet his climb to the presidency did not arrive wrapped in admiration alone. It came with controversy, legal battles, and lingering questions, making his story feel less like a simple victory and more like a tense national reckoning. Long before the presidential campaigns, the court cases, and the fierce debates about his legacy, Bola Ahmed Tinubu's story began in the busy, restless city of Lagos. Lagos is not the kind of place that produces quiet lives. It is loud, competitive, crowded with ambition. People arrive there chasing opportunity, and the city has a way of shaping those who grow up inside it. Tinubu was born on March 29, 1952, into the Tinubu family, a name that carried weight in Lagos society. The family itself traced its roots to Osun State before settling in Lagos, a migration story that mirrors the journeys of many families across southwestern Nigeria. Lagos would become the center of his life and identity. It was the place where he grew up, where he learned to navigate power and influence, and where the foundations of his political career would eventually be built. His early years were spent moving through the educational institutions that shaped many members of Nigeria's emerging elite. He first attended St. John's Primary School in Aroloya, Lagos. From there, his schooling took him to Children's Home School in Ibadan, another city with a long reputation as a center of education and culture. Those early classrooms were the beginning of a journey that would eventually stretch far beyond Nigeria's borders. As he grew older, Tinubu continued his education at the prestigious government college in Ibadan. The school had produced many notable figures in Nigerian public life, and its reputation alone hinted at the type of environment he was entering. For a young man growing up in Nigeria during those decades, education was often seen as the clearest path to opportunity. For Tinubu, that path would soon lead across the Atlantic. Like many Nigerians of his generation who sought advanced education abroad, he eventually traveled to the United States. The move was more than a simple academic step. For many young students, leaving Nigeria at that time studying abroad meant exposure to a completely different system of business, politics, and governance. The experience could reshape how they thought about leadership, institutions, and economic development. Tinubu enrolled at Chicago State University, where he studied accounting. According to available records referenced in the script, he earned a bachelor's degree in accounting in 1979. Not long after that, he continued his studies at the same institution, obtaining a Master of Business Administration in 1983. Those years in the United States became a key part of the story that supporters would later point to when describing his professional background. But even this chapter of his life did not escape controversy. During Nigeria's heated election season, decades later, questions began circulating about his educational credentials. Political rivals and critics raised doubts, suggesting that the details of his academic history deserved closer scrutiny. In the rough and often unforgiving arena of Nigerian politics, such questions quickly turned into a national conversation. Supporters pushed back strongly against those doubts. From the official indications referenced in the original account, there was no credible reason presented to dismiss or invalidate Tinubu's educational credentials. In other words, despite the noise surrounding the issue during the election period, the script emphasizes that nothing conclusive emerged to undermine the record of his studies at Chicago State University. Still, the controversy itself became part of the larger story. In politics, perception often travels faster than proof. Even when allegations remain unresolved or unsupported, the debates they spark can linger in the public imagination for years. After completing his education, Tinubu spent several years working in the United States. These professional experiences helped shape his background in finance and business. The details of those early career years often appear in discussions of his qualifications, especially when supporters describe him as someone who built professional experience abroad before returning home to Nigeria. Eventually, he did return. Like many Nigerians who had studied or worked overseas, he came back to a country that was still navigating its own political and economic challenges. Nigeria in those years was a nation searching for stability and direction. For someone with training in accounting and business administration, the environment offered both opportunity and uncertainty. Yet even this chapter of his life carried another layer of controversy that would resurface later. Some Nigerian media outlets reported that Tinubu's assets had once been frozen by the United States government, with a forfeiture reportedly involving $460,000. Stories like that inevitably attract attention, especially when the individual involved later rises to the highest levels of political influence. Tinubu has consistently denied that the forfeiture was connected to any criminal conviction. According to the information referenced in the script, he rejected the idea that the matter proved wrongdoing. The account also notes that at least within the scope of that discussion, there was no evidence presented to contradict his position. But again, the issue itself remained part of the broader narrative surrounding him. In politics, especially in a country as politically charged as Nigeria, controversies rarely disappear entirely. They resurface during elections, in courtroom arguments, and in public debates about leadership and credibility. What makes Tinubu's story particularly interesting is how these early chapters' education work abroad, and the controversies attached to them became pieces of a much larger puzzle. They shaped how supporters saw him and how critics challenged him. To some observers, the story suggested a man who had gained international experience and financial expertise before returning to help shape Nigeria's future. To others, the unanswered questions were reminders that powerful political figures often carry complicated histories. Either way, those early years laid the groundwork for everything that would follow. The classrooms of Lagos and Ibadan, the lecture halls of Chicago State University, the professional experience in the United States, and the controversies that trailed behind them all became part of the foundation of Tinubu's public identity. And as his life would soon show, that foundation was only the beginning of a much larger political journey. Every political journey has a moment when a private life begins to drift toward the public arena. For Bola Ahmed Tinubu, that shift did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, shaped by the turbulence of Nigerian politics in the final decades of the 20th century. Nigeria in those years was a nation caught between competing futures. Military governments rose and fell, democratic hopes appeared and disappeared, and many citizens wondered when civilian rule would finally take root again. In that uncertain environment, a new generation of political actors began stepping forward, determined to push the country toward democratic governance. Tinubu's first serious step into politics came through the Social Democratic Party, widely known as the SDP. At the time, the SDP was one of the major political platforms through which Nigerians attempted to build a civilian political order after years of military rule. It attracted professionals, activists, and reform-minded figures who believed Nigeria needed institutions strong enough to support democracy. For Tinubu, joining the SDP was more than a symbolic move. It was the beginning of a political identity that would grow stronger over time. Through the party, he became involved in the conversations and alliances shaping Nigeria's emerging democratic movement. But Nigerian politics in that era was rarely stable for long. The struggle between democratic aspirations and military authority soon intensified. When political tensions escalated under the military regime of General Sani Abacha, the space for opposition narrowed sharply. Many politicians, activists, and civil society leaders faced pressure, intimidation, or exile. It was during this tense period that Tinubu became associated with the National Democratic Coalition, widely known as NADECO. NADECO emerged as one of the most visible pro-democracy movements in Nigeria, bringing together political figures, intellectuals, and activists who openly challenged military rule and demanded a return to democratic governance. The coalition's message was simple but powerful. Nigeria, they argued, could not move forward without civilian leadership chosen by the people. Their activism helped sustain pressure against the military regime during one of the country's most politically difficult periods. Tinubu's involvement in this movement placed him among those pushing for democratic change. It was not an easy position to hold at the time. The political climate was tense, and many who participated in pro-democracy activism faced serious risks. Yet those years became a defining chapter in Nigeria's eventual transition away from military rule. By the late 1990s, the political landscape began to shift again. The pressure for reform, combined with internal changes within the country, opened the door for a return to civilian governance. Nigeria prepared to move into a new democratic era, and elections were scheduled as part of that transition. For many political actors who had been involved in the struggle for democracy, this moment felt like the beginning of a new chapter. For Tinubu, it would soon become the turning point that transformed him from a participant in political movements into a major public office holder. In 1999, Nigeria held elections that marked the country's return to democratic rule. It was a historic moment, one that many Nigerians had waited years to see. Among the contests taking place across the country was the race for governor of Lagosstate. Lagos was no ordinary state. It was Nigeria's commercial center, its largest city, and a place where political influence often carried national consequences. Whoever governed Lagos would be responsible for managing one of the most complex urban environments in Africa. Tinubu ran for governor under the platform of the Alliance for Democracy, a political party that drew much of its support from the southwest region of Nigeria. When the votes were counted, he emerged as the winner of the election. His victory marked the beginning of an 8-year tenure that would later define much of his reputation in Nigerian politics. Taking office as governor of Lagos State placed Tinubu at the center of a huge administrative challenge. Lagos was growing rapidly, struggling with infrastructure pressure, urban congestion, and the demands of millions of residents navigating daily life in one of Africa's largest cities. The expectations surrounding the new administration were enormous. Lagos was not just another state. It was a symbol of Nigeria's economic energy and its governance challenges all at once. From the beginning of his tenure, Tinubu's administration projected the image of a government focused on reform and development. Policies and programs were introduced with the aim of strengthening the state's institutions and improving public services. Supporters would later point to this period as the time when Tinubu began building the political identity that would follow him for decades. Lagos, in their view, became the stage where his administrative ideas and political instincts were first tested on a large scale. During those years, his leadership style began to attract attention beyond the state itself. Lagos was not just a local arena. What happened there often echoed across the country. Observers began to see Tinubu not only as a governor, but also as a political strategist, capable of building networks and alliances. Over time, that reputation grew stronger. But at this stage of the story, what mattered most was the sense that Lagos had become the center of his political rise. The city offered both challenges and opportunities, and the decisions made there would shape how Nigerians eventually judged his leadership. His years as governor would later be remembered as a defining chapter of his career. For supporters, this period demonstrated a commitment to reform and development. For critics, it would become the subject of ongoing debate about the true impact of those policies. Either way, the importance of Lagos in Tinubu's political journey cannot be overstated. It was there that his ideas about governance, institutions, and economic development began to take practical form. And more importantly, it was there that his political legend began to grow. The city that had shaped his early life was now shaping his national reputation. Lagos was no longer just the place where he was born and raised. It had become the proving ground where Bola Ahmed Tinubu began transforming from a participant in Nigeria's democratic struggle into one of the country's most influential political figures. Everything that followed in his career, from political alliances to national influence, would trace its roots back to those years when he governed Nigeria's most dynamic state. The Lagos chapter was only beginning, but the foundations of a political legacy were already being laid. When supporters talk about Bola Ahmed Tinubu's years as governor of Lagos State, this is usually the part of the story they linger on. Not the controversies, not the political battles, but the period they believe transformed the direction of Nigeria's most crowded and complicated state. To understand why those years still carry so much weight in Nigerian politics, you have to imagine what Lagos felt like at the turn of the millennium. The city was already enormous. Millions of people moved through its roads every day. Businesses expanded, markets grew louder, neighborhoods stretched farther outward. But the infrastructure of the state was struggling to keep pace with the energy of its population. Roads were congested, services were stretched thin. Institutions that were supposed to manage the chaos often lacked the structure or resources to do so effectively. When Tinubu took office in 1999, the task in front of his administration was not simply to run the government. It was to find a way to make Lagos function as a modern economic center, while its population kept growing at a relentless speed. Supporters of his administration argue that one of the most visible changes during those years came through infrastructure. Lagos had always depended heavily on its road networks, and improving those networks became a central focus of the government's approach to development. Across the state road, construction and rehabilitation projects began to reshape the transportation landscape. Major highways and key routes received attention, and the government pushed forward with projects that aimed to ease movement across one of Africa's busiest urban regions. Among the roads often mentioned were the Lekki Expressway, the Lagos-Badagry Expressway, and the Lagos-Abeokuta Expressway. These corridors were critical not just for daily commuters, but also for trade logistics and economic activity across the state. By the time Tinubu's tenure ended, reports referenced in the script suggested that more than 2,000 kilometers of roads had been constructed or rehabilitated. For a city where mobility directly affects economic productivity, that scale of work carried enormous significance. But infrastructure in Lagos could not be reduced to roads alone. Housing was another challenge pressing on the state. As the population grew, demand for affordable homes rose sharply. In response, the administration embarked on a public housing program aimed at expanding access to accommodation for residents. Across different parts of Lagos, state housing developments began to appear as part of that initiative. According to the figures cited in the original account, more than 20,000 housing units were constructed through the government's efforts. For thousands of families, these projects represented an opportunity to move into more stable and structured living environments. Supporters saw the housing push as part of a broader attempt to manage the explosive urban growth that Lagos was experiencing. Infrastructure and housing were only part of the picture. For any government hoping to sustain large development programs, financial stability is essential. And this is where another aspect of Tinubu's administration began to attract attention: the restructuring of Lagos State's revenue system. At the beginning of his tenure, the state's internally generated revenue was relatively modest. Lagos depended heavily on federal allocations, and the capacity of the state government to raise its own funds was limited. Tinubu's administration began introducing reforms designed to change that situation. Central to this effort was the reorganization of the state's tax collection system. The government established the Lagos State Internal Revenue Service as an autonomous agency responsible for managing tax collection more efficiently. The goal was to improve transparency, reduce leakages, and build a system capable of supporting the state's growing financial needs. Technology also became part of the reform effort. Computerized systems were introduced to help track and monitor revenue collection. These changes aimed to bring greater order and accountability to a process that had previously struggled with inefficiencies. One of the most visible components of the reform was the introduction of the land use charge. This policy replaced several existing taxes and levies with a unified system tied to property ownership. The intention was to simplify the tax structure while ensuring that the state could generate sustainable revenue from its expanding urban property market. The results of these reforms became one of the most frequently cited indicators of the administration's success. At the beginning of Tinubu's tenure in 1999, Lagos State's internally generated revenue was estimated at about 4.4 billion naira. Over the following years, that figure rose steadily. By 2000, it had climbed to roughly 6.9 billion. The following year, it crossed 10 billion naira. The upward trend continued year after year: 14.9 billion in 2002, 16.7 billion in 2003, and over 18 billion by 2004. The momentum did not slow. By 2007, the final year of Tinubu's governorship, the state's internally generated revenue had reached approximately 28.4 billion naira. For supporters, those numbers told a powerful story. They suggested that Lagos was learning how to finance its own development rather than relying almost entirely on federal support. The growth in internally generated revenue became one of the pillars of the argument that Tinubu's administration had fundamentally changed the financial capacity of the state. Yet development in a city like Lagos also requires institutions capable of managing everyday urban life. One of the most visible examples from Tinubu's time in office was the creation of the Lagos State Traffic Management Authority, commonly known as LASTMA. Traffic congestion had long been one of the defining frustrations of life in Lagos. The city's roads carried millions of vehicles every day, and the absence of coordinated traffic management often turned daily commutes into exhausting ordeals. LASMA was created in the year 2000 to bring structure to that chaos. The agency's role was to regulate traffic flow, enforce road safety rules, and help reduce accidents across the city's busy road network. In its early months, reports suggested that the presence of trained traffic officials on the streets helped ease congestion in several parts of the state. According to figures referenced in the script, traffic congestion was reduced by about 40% within the first few months of the agency's operations. Over time, LASMA grew into a recognizable part of Lagos life. Its officers became a common sight at intersections and major highways, guiding vehicles and attempting to maintain order in a city where the number of cars seemed to increase every year. Another major institutional reform during Tinubu's tenure addressed an equally pressing challenge: waste management. Lagos had long struggled with the problem of garbage disposal. Rapid urban growth meant that the volume of waste produced by residents and businesses continued to rise, placing pressure on the city's sanitation systems. To address this issue, the administration strengthened the Lagosstate Waste Management Authority, widely known as LAMA. The initiative included efforts to modernize waste collection and introduce new systems for managing disposal across the state. One of the most significant changes involved the privatization of parts of the waste collection process. Private operators were brought into the system to help expand the capacity for collecting and transporting refuse from neighborhoods across Lagos. The scale of the operation grew rapidly. According to the figures mentioned in the script, the number of waste collection trucks increased dramatically from just 10 vehicles to roughly 270. Mechanized street sweepers also expanded in number, rising from about 20 to around 400. New transfer loading stations were established to manage the movement of waste from collection points to disposal sites, and landfill facilities were expanded to accommodate the growing needs of the city. For residents who had long lived with overflowing waste and limited sanitation infrastructure, these changes represented an attempt to bring order to a problem that had once seemed impossible to manage. Taken together, these initiatives created a narrative that supporters continue to emphasize when discussing Tinubu's years in Lagos. Roads were built and expanded. Housing projects increased the supply of homes. Tax reforms dramatically boosted the state's financial capacity. New institutions were created to manage traffic and waste in a rapidly expanding city. For many observers, the key idea behind all these efforts was the belief that Lagos needed stronger systems institutions capable of supporting a city whose population and economic activity were growing at extraordinary speed. In that sense, Tinubu's administration was often described not simply as a government focused on individual projects, but as one attempting to build the structural foundations for long-term urban governance. And this is why, years later, supporters still return to this period when explaining his political influence. They see Lagos during those years as proof that complex reforms, if pursued consistently, can reshape the trajectory of a state. For them, the story of Lagos under Tinubu is not just about roads, taxes, or institutions. It is about the idea that a city overwhelmed by growth could begin to organize itself into something more structured, more resilient, and more economically powerful. That belief, whether fully accepted or still debated, became one of the central pillars of Bola Ahmed Tinubu's political legend. But every story of progress carries another side, and when people talk honestly about Lagos during Bola Ahmed Tinubu's years as governor, that other side eventually enters the conversation. Development in a city as complex as Lagos rarely moves in a straight line. Even as roads were built, institutions were created, and revenue grew, many of the city's most stubborn problems refused to disappear. Perhaps nowhere was that tension more visible than on the roads themselves. Traffic had always been one of the defining features of life in Lagos. It shaped daily routines, determined how businesses operated, and often tested the patience of millions of commuters moving across the city every day. The creation of the Lagos State Traffic Management Authority, LASTMA, was meant to bring structure to that chaos. And for a time, there were signs that the presence of trained traffic officials could help ease congestion in certain areas. But Lagos was growing faster than any system could fully control. Even as traffic management improved in some places, the sheer number of vehicles on the road continued to increase. Population growth pushed more people into the city. Car ownership expanded. New commercial districts appeared, drawing more traffic into already crowded corridors. The result was a familiar Lagos reality: long hours spent in traffic, sometimes in the same places where new road projects had once promised relief. Supporters of the administration often argued that traffic congestion was not a problem any single government could completely solve, especially in a city expanding as quickly as Lagos. But for residents sitting inside buses and cars on gridlocked roads, the frustration was real. LASTMA itself, despite its early achievements, also became the subject of criticism over the years. Some motorists complained about the behavior of certain officials, describing encounters that felt confrontational or unnecessarily aggressive. There were allegations of corruption, with reports that some officers demanded bribes from drivers. Other critics argued that the agency sometimes relied too heavily on force when enforcing traffic laws, leading to physical confrontations with road users. Questions also emerged about training. Some observers believed that certain officers were not adequately prepared to handle the complicated situations they encountered on the streets of a megacity like Lagos, and there were persistent concerns about whether the agency had enough funding and resources to perform its duties effectively. To be fair, many of these criticisms were not unique to LASTMA. Institutions operating in fast-growing cities often struggle with the gap between their responsibilities and the resources available to them. Over time, successive Lagos state governments introduced training programs, whistleblower policies, and other measures aimed at addressing some of these concerns. But the criticisms remained part of the broader conversation about traffic management in the state. Waste management presented another challenge, where progress and difficulty existed side by side. The Lagos State Waste Management Authority (LAMA) had been strengthened during Tinubu's administration to deal with the growing mountains of waste produced by the city's expanding population. Privatizing parts of the waste collection process and expanding the fleet of trucks helped improve the system's capacity. More vehicles appeared on the streets collecting refuse, and new facilities were introduced to manage disposal. Yet Lagos generated waste at a staggering pace. Despite the expansion of collection services, problems with garbage disposal persisted in many parts of the city. Illegal dumping became a recurring issue, particularly in neighborhoods where residents either lacked easy access to waste collection services or chose to avoid paying for them. Overflowing landfills and unmanaged dumps occasionally appeared as reminders that sanitation in a megacity requires constant effort and resources. Even years after the reforms began, the Lagos state government continued to spend enormous sums on waste management. At one point, reports indicated that more than 500 million naira was being spent each month on the system, and still challenges remained. Officials identified more than 1,000 illegal dump sites across the state, highlighting the scale of the problem. Part of the difficulty came from infrastructure, but part of it also came from behavior. Waste management systems depend not only on trucks and facilities, but also on public participation. When residents ignore proper disposal practices, even well-designed systems can struggle to keep up. Beyond traffic and sanitation, Lagos also faced deeper structural problems that were not easily solved by state policy alone. Electricity was one of them. During Tinubu's years as governor, the state made efforts to improve power generation and distribution. But Nigeria's electricity system has long been shaped by national policies and federal institutions. For residents of Lagos, the result was familiar frequent power outages that disrupted businesses and daily life. Even when the state government attempted to support improvements, many communities still experienced unreliable electricity supply. For small business owners, shopkeepers, and families, that instability created daily frustrations. Environmental challenges added another layer to the city's difficulties. Lagos sits in a coastal region where flooding is a recurring threat. Rapid urban development combined with drainage problems and sanitation issues made certain areas particularly vulnerable. During and after Tinubu's tenure, flooding and poor sanitation remained issues that successive governments continued to battle. These realities reminded residents that managing a rapidly expanding megacity requires constant adaptation. No administration could solve every problem at once. And while infrastructure and institutions were important parts of governance, social programs often revealed a more complicated picture of policy outcomes. During Tinubu's tenure, the government introduced several initiatives aimed at addressing poverty, unemployment, and economic opportunity. Some programs were designed to support entrepreneurship or provide financial assistance to small businesses. Others focused on youth empowerment and job creation. But not all of these initiatives achieved the impact that policymakers had hoped for. One example mentioned in the original account was the Youth Empowerment Scheme, introduced in 2003. The program aimed to provide skills training and startup capital for unemployed young people in Lagos. On paper, the idea carried enormous promise. A growing city needed opportunities for its youth, and programs like this were meant to help build those opportunities. Yet reports suggested that the program struggled with allegations of corruption and mismanagement. According to a report referenced by the Lagos State House of Assembly in 2005, only about 15% of the beneficiaries actually received the startup capital they had been promised. Eventually, the program was scrapped in 2007. Other poverty alleviation initiatives faced similar difficulties. Microcredit programs designed to help small businesses sometimes struggled with repayment rates. In one case, a report indicated that only 16% of beneficiaries were able to repay their loans, raising concerns about the sustainability of the program. Healthcare initiatives also showed a mixed outcome. Tinubu's administration invested in improving access to healthcare by establishing primary healthcare centers and introducing programs aimed at helping vulnerable groups, including pregnant women and young children. Hospitals and clinics were upgraded, and disease control measures were introduced. These efforts laid important groundwork for improvements in the healthcare system. But significant challenges remained. Maternal mortality rates in Lagos were still high during those years. In 2003, the rate was estimated at about 445 deaths per 100,000 live births. While that figure would eventually decline, it remained a serious concern. Access to healthcare also varied across communities. Many residents still faced difficulties reaching medical facilities due to distance cost or limited services in certain areas. The healthcare workforce presented another challenge. The doctor-to-patient ratio in Lagos was estimated at about 1 doctor for every 5,000 patients, far below the recommended level. Education followed a similar pattern of progress mixed with persistent problems. The government increased funding for schools, built new classrooms, and introduced programs such as free primary education. Enrollment rates began to rise, reflecting the impact of these policies. Yet the system still faced serious obstacles. At one point, it was estimated that more than 1 million children in Lagos were out of school. Teacher quality was another concern. Reports suggested that only around 40% of teachers in the state were fully qualified at the time. Funding also remained below recommended levels. Even as the government increased education spending, the percentage of the state budget allocated to education still fell short of international recommendations. All of these challenges painted a more complicated picture of governance in Lagos. On one hand, major reforms had reshaped parts of the state's infrastructure and financial system. On the other hand, the realities of urban growth, social inequality, and institutional limitations meant that progress often came with setbacks. And perhaps that is the most honest way to understand this period of Lagos history. It was not a story of perfect transformation. It was a story of ambition colliding with complexity. A government attempting to modernize a rapidly expanding megacity while confronting the limits of policy resources and human systems. For supporters, the achievements still stand as evidence of administrative vision. For critics, the unresolved challenges remain equally important. And somewhere between those two perspectives lies the full reality of Lagos during the Tinubu years, a city changing, improving in some ways, struggling in others, and revealing just how difficult it can be to govern one of the largest urban centers on the African continent. Over time, the influence built in Lagos did not remain confined within the borders of the state. The networks formed during those years began stretching outward, quietly connecting Tinubu to political actors across Nigeria. Governors, ministers, party leaders, and legislators started appearing within a circle often described as his political protégés. Supporters frequently pointed to this expanding network as evidence that the Lagos years had produced something larger than a state government. They had produced a political power center. In many ways, Tinubu's reputation as a strategist grew during this period. Nigerian politics is not only about holding office, It is also about building alliances, shaping party structures, and identifying leaders who can carry influence into different parts of the country. Tinubu became known for that ability. He helped nurture political figures who would later occupy important positions, strengthening the idea that his role extended beyond the governor's office he once held. Part of that growing influence was tied to the evolution of opposition politics in Nigeria. After leaving office as governor in 2007, Tinubu remained deeply involved in party organization. One of the political vehicles associated with him was the Action Congress of Nigeria, often known as the ACN. The party played a significant role in the opposition landscape at a time when Nigeria's ruling political establishment appeared difficult to challenge. But opposition politics in Nigeria rarely stand still. Alliances shift, parties merge, and new coalitions form when the political moment demands it. Eventually, the ACN joined forces with other opposition groups in a historic merger that produced the All Progressives Congress, the APC. That coalition would later become one of the most powerful political parties in the country. For many observers, Tinubu's involvement in these developments reinforced the idea that he had become more than a former governor. He was now widely regarded as one of the most influential political organizers in Nigeria. His role in strengthening opposition structures and shaping alliances contributed to the reputation that followed him for years, that of a power broker capable of influencing the direction of national politics. Alongside this political identity, another dimension of his public image began to take shape through philanthropy. The Bola Ahmed Tinubu Foundation became one of the channels through which charitable and social initiatives were carried out. The foundation focused on areas such as education, youth empowerment, and poverty alleviation. Through scholarships, support programs, and community initiatives, these activities contributed to the narrative that Tinubu's influence extended beyond politics into social development. Recognition and awards followed as well. Over the years, various organizations acknowledged his contributions to governance and public life. Supporters often described these efforts as part of a broader commitment to improving opportunities for young Nigerians and strengthening communities. Yet, as with many figures who occupy powerful positions for long periods of time, Tinubu's public life also attracted scrutiny and criticism. Allegations of corruption and financial misconduct occasionally surfaced in political debates and media reports. One accusation mentioned in the original account came from a former Lagos State Commissioner for Economic Planning and Budget in 2018. The allegation suggested that Tinubu had misappropriated Lagostate funds during his time as governor and maintained control over the state's revenue account for personal benefit. Another controversy emerged in 2020 when a group known as the Coalition Against Corruption and Bad Governance accused him of fraudulently selling a Lagos state government property located on Bodyline Road in Ikoyi to a company allegedly connected to his family. Earlier in 2016, a former Deputy National Publicity Secretary of the APC publicly accused Tinubu of money laundering, claiming that funds from Lagos State had been used to purchase properties in the United States and the United Kingdom. There were also accusations related to alleged tax evasion. In 2019, an anti-corruption organization claimed that he had failed to pay taxes on certain properties in Lagos and had been able to avoid payment because of his political influence. But in each of these cases, Tinubu rejected the accusations. He consistently denied wrongdoing and maintained that the allegations were either politically motivated or unsupported. According to the information presented in the script, he has not been formally charged or convicted of any corruption-related offense connected to those claims. And so his story at the national level grew more complex. To supporters, he remained a master strategist who helped reshape Nigeria's political landscape while supporting social initiatives through philanthropy. To critics, the allegations and controversies raised questions that continued to follow him through the years. What is certain, however, is that the influence first built in Lagos had now expanded far beyond it. By the time his name began appearing regularly in discussions about Nigeria's highest office, Bola Ahmed Tinubu had already become one of the most consequential political figures in the country. And then the story arrives at the question that hangs over everything else. What might a Bola Ahmed Tinubu presidency actually mean for Nigeria? It's a question that doesn't come with a simple answer. Nigeria is a vast and complicated country, shaped by dozens of cultures, political interests, and economic pressures that no single leader can control. But when people try to imagine the direction a Tinubu presidency might take, they often return to the same place his years governing Lagos. Supporters look at that period and see a pattern. They remember the emphasis on infrastructure, the push to strengthen revenue systems, and the creation of institutions meant to keep a rapidly growing city functioning. In their view, those experiences suggest a leader who understands how economic development and governance systems fit together. So the argument begins there. If the same mindset were applied on a national scale, they believe it could reshape parts of Nigeria's development strategy. Infrastructure, for example, remains one of the country's most urgent challenges. Roads, rail networks, airports, and water systems all require enormous investment if the country is to keep pace with its growing population. The thinking among his supporters is that someone who prioritized infrastructure in Lagos might push similar priorities nationwide, identifying key transport corridors, strengthening logistics networks, and investing in projects designed to support economic growth. Another area often mentioned is taxation and revenue generation. Nigeria has long struggled with limited internal revenue compared to the size of its economy. Much of government funding still depends heavily on oil revenues. Tinubu's supporters point to the dramatic increase in Lagostate's internally generated revenue during his time as governor, and suggest that a similar philosophy could be applied at the federal level. The idea would be to strengthen revenue collection systems, improve transparency, and expand the government's ability to fund development projects without relying so heavily on external resources. Then, there are the institutions themselves. In Lagos, several agencies were either created or strengthened to address specific problems from traffic management to tax administration. At the national level, governance challenges often stem from weak institutions, overlapping responsibilities, and limited coordination between agencies. Those who believe in Tinubu's administrative style argue that institutional reform could become one of the defining themes of his presidency. Strengthening regulatory bodies, improving coordination across ministries, and modernizing public administration could be part of that effort. Security presents another enormous test. Nigeria's insecurity challenges are complex, ranging from terrorism and banditry to kidnapping and communal violence. The script suggests that addressing these problems may require more than simply increasing military operations. The root causes, poverty, unemployment, and social inequality, often play a role in fueling instability. A government shaped by that perspective might combine security operations with economic policies aimed at creating jobs and expanding opportunity. Strengthening security forces, improving intelligence coordination, and encouraging community participation in policing could all become part of the strategy. Electricity is another area where expectations often emerge. Nigeria's power supply remains one of the country's most persistent development barriers. Businesses rely heavily on private generators, and frequent outages disrupt everyday life. The script suggests that a future administration could focus on expanding generation capacity, diversifying the energy mix, and encouraging private sector investment in the power sector. There is also the broader question of governance itself. Running Nigeria requires balancing competing regional interests while trying to maintain national unity. Tinubu's long career in political negotiation and coalition building could prove useful in navigating that complicated terrain. His supporters often describe him as a skilled negotiator capable of working across political lines. But alongside these possibilities, there are also risks. The corruption allegations that have followed Tinubu for years continue to shape public perception. Even though he has denied the accusations and has not been formally convicted of corruption-related offenses, critics argue that such controversies could complicate his leadership. And beyond the personal debates surrounding any one leader, Nigeria itself presents immense structural challenges. Economic inequality, regional tensions, and security crises are problems that cannot be solved quickly. So when people ask what a Tinubu presidency might bring, the honest answer is that it remains uncertain. What exists instead is a set of possibilities shaped by his record, his political experience, and the expectations of a nation that has seen both progress and disappointment from leaders before. Whether those possibilities become reality would depend not only on one man, but on the institutions, partnerships, and decisions that shape Nigeria's future. Bola Ahmed Tinubu's story is not a simple one. It is a path shaped by ambition, political skill, visible achievements, and controversies that continue to spark debate. For some, he represents strategic leadership and transformation. For others, his journey raises difficult questions. But one thing is certain: the expectations placed on him are enormous. And as Nigeria continues to watch his story unfold, if you found this journey worth exploring, consider liking, subscribing, and staying with us for the next story.